From the studios of the Optimism Institute, welcome to the Blue Sky Podcast. I'm your host, Bill Burke, and in every Blue Sky episode, we'll be speaking to leaders, researchers, and thinkers whose stories and insights will remind us that there is always blue sky above. Sometimes you just have to get your head above the clouds to see it. Today's Blue Sky guest has a background in scientific research that is deep and varied. But it's her work studying the beneficial physical effects of a positive lifestyle that got our attention. Immaculata De Vivo is best known for her study of genetics and the epidemiology of cancer. But earlier this year, she and co-author Daniel Lumera published a book called The Biology of Kindness. And it's a fascinating look at the true scientific physical benefits of following what they describe as 5 fundamental values: kindness, optimism, forgiveness, gratitude, and happiness. Naturally, when I heard about and read this book, I knew Immaculata would be a great guest on Blue Sky. Immaculata De Vivo is an international leader in the study of the epidemiology of cancer. She's the faculty co-director of the sciences at Harvard Radcliffe Institute, a professor of medicine at Harvard Medical School, and a professor of epidemiology at the Harvard T.H. Chan School for Public Health. Immaculata is also a leader in the fascinating field of telomere biology. You'll learn more about this soon. She received her doctorate and MPH from Columbia University, did her postdoctoral work at the University of California, Berkeley, and at Stanford University. I hope you enjoy this Blue Sky conversation with Immaculata De Vivo as much as I did. Immaculata De Vivo, welcome to the Blue Sky Podcast.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, Bill.
I really enjoyed your book, Biology of Kindness. I found your background really interesting with specializing in epidemiology and emphasis on cancer. You wouldn't necessarily expect someone with your background to co-author this book. Can you tell me how that came about and how your interest in this subject came about?
Right. Where do I get off writing a book like this, right?
Yeah.
Card-carrying molecular biologist, tweaking genes in mice, and there I am writing a trade book with a title that's captured just the imagination of everyone.
Yes.
I have to give credit to colleagues at Harvard for really opening my mind even further. As a scientist, we're curious and we're open-minded just by definition. And so I've been someone who has been studying genes and how genes work. And as I got deeper and deeper into research in my career, I realized many chronic diseases are not so much a result of changes to your DNA, but rather a combination of, there's this interplay, entanglement, so to speak, between your genes and the environment. And so I understood, and understanding at this point, before I wrote this book, my understanding of the genetic underpinnings was pretty solid. I've written, upwards of 350 papers in scientifically peer-reviewed journals and been funded by the National Institutes of Health since forever. So I thought I really need to shore up this understanding of the environment. And so after leaving Stanford and I joined the faculty at Harvard, I became increasingly interested in this interplay of the genes and the environment and working within Harvard cohorts and understanding risk factors and resources. And I use the environment here writ large to explain, to suggest lifestyle and behavior. And also as this card carrying, they called me the geneticist, I was asked to be on a lot of research grants to help epidemiologists and social scientists to provide objective measures for their exposures that they were studying. The exposures here again, environmental lifestyle. For instance, they'd say, Immaculata, we need you to help us give a biological handle on we're measuring stress, and we're measuring trauma, and we're measuring optimism. We're measuring other types of prosocial behaviors. You've done a good job measuring objectively the impact of obesity or physical activity on this DNA marker that you're so associated with, which are telomeres. Can you help us with our research? We have all these questionnaires and we have all these surveys, but it would really shore up if we could get a better handle on the biology, because we know, Bill, that certain lifestyles, we know that obesity causes, I'm going to go out on a limb here and say causes, because, we're always so hesitant. We use correlations. It causes bad things, right? It puts you at risk for disease, chronic disease, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, right? And so the idea is that these other behaviors, these other less conventional resources, can we measure them? And so I would have to say around the 2000s or so, I started incorporating more and more measurements of environment. Okay, again, a writ large word, and how it interacted with genes, right? And so this idea that the two of them, or the multifactorialness would put you at risk, as well as, if you have the negative, you could also have the positive. Are there ways in which, and there's the optimist in me, I am and yes. As a scientist, all right, you have to be an optimist by definition. Okay, Bill, yes. Because what you see published is probably 5% of the success stories, and 90, yes, because you set your experiments up and you get failures, but you say, you know what? Tomorrow's another day. I'm going to come into the lab, I'm going to come into the office, and I'm going to try tweaking the variables this way or that way, changing these conditions. I'm going to tell my students or my postdocs, well, try it this way, try it that way. So we're born optimists. Otherwise, You would have given up a long time ago. So it's a long-winded response to how did I get involved? I got involved because I really wanted to understand, my curiosity was to understand the biological underpinnings of behavioral and lifestyle interventions, because there is biology there. And so behavioral practices, meditation, physical activity, practicing optimism, they're ultimately acting through biology. And it's not just magic. And we see the outcomes through health span or lack of health span.
Right. No, it was very refreshing for me because, when I talk about these things, I'm an extremely non-scientific person. A lot of I believe it in my gut. To have someone with your background and your experience say the things the way you do was so reinforcing, frankly, to me. It was really a great read for me. Needless to say, it was music to this podcast host's ears when Immaculata said that, as a scientist, you have to be an optimist. Now, I'm no scientist, but I get it. Like so many professions, practicing scientific research is marked by far more failures than successes. And you have to believe that, as Immaculata, and I must add, Scarlett O'Hara famously said, tomorrow is another day. Getting back to our conversation, I wanted Immaculata to talk about the role, complementary or otherwise, that genes and the environment play in our lives. You said something, or I think you quoted somebody else, or maybe it's just a common quote that I hadn't heard before about I saw it as a nature-nurture debate. The quote is, genes load the gun, the environment pulls the trigger. I'd never heard that before, but I grew up, I guess, learning or at least thinking that genes are set and you are what you are. But you're saying the environment really is what pulls the trigger on your predispositions.
That is a quote that is not, I did not come up with that, but I use that a lot. I want to say it was a campaign by the National Cancer Institute, but we could get the confirmation for that. But many of my colleagues have used it. So for the most part, your genes are immutable, right? And genes change over time, but we're talking a long time, right? So it's sort of like the long game, right? What I'm referring to is the epigenome. Okay, so this is the part of your DNA that's sort of more short term or medium term. Changes do happen through the methylation, through these processes, but also where I specialize in as part of the epigenome is I study this marker that's called telomeres, right? And telomeres are bits of DNA. They're these repetitive sequences, okay, that cap, or they're the ends of your chromosome. So the chromosome is this linear, we have linear, our DNA is organized in these linear features, these linear chromosomes, sort of like a skyscraper. And so the basement and the top level have the telomeres, right? And they're there to essentially make sure that the chromosome stays put, doesn't become unraveled. It's sort of like the shoelaces, right? This is not my quote. The little plastic tips on the shoelaces keep the shoelaces from fraying, and that's the role of the telomeres. So so not to bore people and become super technical, but the telomeres are a variable length, these repetitive sequences, and they're made or designed so that as a cell becomes old, it loses some. So there's a natural shortening that happens. And that is for another podcast where it's necessary for the shortening to actually save the cell from other damage. But the interest is that there's shortening and then there's accelerated shortening. And that's the real issue. It's how do we buffer the accelerated shortening, because you don't want aging to happen so fast, right? And so this is where we are seeing, and not just me, the UK Biobank. I mean, when I first started out, it's sort of like, oh, you're crazy, one of those, but
Yeah.
I could be, two things can be true. I can be crazy, but I could also be really wanting to understand these different rates, right?
Yeah.
Of shortening. And,
right.
And sure, since then, I can't just many, many papers are in PubMed that show that, yes, lifestyle seems to be shaping our telomeres, in the good and the bad, right? So the book essentially tries to take the information and make it accessible. And some of my colleagues, they say, well, you don't want to run the risk of sounding woo-woo. And with all due respect, I say, colleague to colleague, we could bore each other under the table with the technicalities and the jargon.
Yeah.
We could do that. That doesn't serve anybody any good. Because at the point where you talk to these brilliant people across different disciplines and they don't understand the basic of, you mean if I do physical activity, it actually changes my blood markers and maybe even my DNA? And I say, yeah, we have shown, our group, the De Vivo group, the De Vivo lab, and others have shown that we can provide at the molecular level, at the DNA level, proof that stuff like lifestyle behaviors has an impact.
Right.
And so increasingly, the idea is to make it accessible, because it was shocking to me 15 years ago that these brilliant people in other disciplines, they didn't understand. And I thought, if they don't understand this, or if they don't have access to this, what about other people that are not even, working with me at Harvard, or wherever else I was working? So it really drove me to, now, it took a while before the book came about. I mean, the story of how the book came about is a little different in that it was this interaction with a very practicing meditator, a monk, that's got its own life. But the idea was, the overarching reason for writing such a trade book was to really make the information accessible so that
Right.
everyone had an understanding that, yes, genes are, your DNA for the most part is immutable, but
Right.
there are parts of your DNA that you can actually do something about.
And I'm glad you trusted your instincts, because I would not have made it through the other book that they wanted you to write. I was there for the woo-woo. So, I actually understood it. And what you're saying now is reinforcing what I thought I understood when I read it. So thank you.
It's about accessibility. It's not about dumbing it down.
No.
It's actually harder to write a book like this.
Yeah, exactly.
Than it is to say, well, here's my last PNAS paper. Just read it.
Yes.
You'll figure it out. Yeah.
Genes load the gun, the environment pulls the trigger, is a memorable way to think about how these different variables impact our behavioral characteristics and health. And Immaculata, particularly in her book, The Biology of Kindness, does a great job explaining the role that telomeres play in these processes, and she also gives encouragement that our participating in healthy activities, like eating well and exercising, can truly change our blood and DNA markers. Getting back to our conversation, I asked Immaculata to discuss the 5 values she lays out in her book. As you might guess, I'll eventually lean in a little extra hard on the second item on this handy and helpful list, optimism. So the first part of your book, you write about the 5 values that are key to well-being. I'll list the 5, and we're going to focus on a couple. You won't be surprised that optimism will be one. The 5 are kindness, optimism, forgiveness, gratitude, and happiness. Before we dive deep into optimism, I want to talk about kindness. The book is called The Biology of Kindness. You said something really interesting, and it echoed something I read in a book I really enjoyed by Rutger Bregman called Humankind. And you talked about how we've sort of been done a disservice by thinking that Darwin's law was all about survival of the fittest, the toughest, the strongest. But really the best evolutionary strategy is kindness and also ability to adapt and change. So it's not just this tough, strong. Am I describing it well? And can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, I'm a Darwin fangirl, actually. I actually just did a project that will also be turned into a book soon. It's called The Path to Darwin.
Oh, wow.
It's again a book, somewhat of a trade book of how we stand on the shoulders of giants from early Greeks, even before that. And so the idea is, it's all about adaptability. In order to survive evolutionarily, you need to adapt. So, if we take Darwin's finches, he noticed that the beaks were either longer or shorter or wider or thinner, depending on where they were in the Galapagos and what kind of food they were eating, right? Were they trees? Were they nuts? Were they seeds? Were they fruit? So your ability to adapt is what allows you to survive. And actually, that quote has been, like many quotes over time, people, it's sort of like a game of telephone. There's a little bit of misinformation, and there's a lot of projection, and then there's, you don't really know what it was. But the idea is that, yes, it is about adaptation. Sort of, you can adapt to altitude, you can adapt to the kindness. Working with Daniel, I have to go back to Daniel, because when we met at this meeting in 2019, it was a science meeting, and I had been invited to present scientific data that supports the impact of lifestyle behaviors as well as practices like meditation. Because I had a scientific paper that's called Loving Kindness Meditation. Yeah, with my colleagues who's a psychiatrist who treats women with depression. And it wasn't just the telomere measurements that were in the paper, but there was also, brain scans. So it's the preponderance of evidence to show that there's something going on here with women who are long-term meditators of this particular type. so going back to Daniel and kindness, so he said, and he led a session on the practice of meditation. And I was really just, it resonated with me because I've been doing meditation since even before graduate school at Columbia, but more formally when I was at Columbia with groups and things and Buddhist centers in New York. So we got together because the title was Biology of Kindness. And so we got together and he said, oh, we got to write a book about this because I've always been interested in, from a spiritual sense, I talk about these values, right? But I had no idea that we could actually shore them up with there's a science behind it. I said, well, I don't actually study kindness per se, but since I was coming to Italy, I wanted a really nice title. I wanted something that was, something that would be a little bit more romantic, so to speak, something a bit more, And so he said, well, let's write this trade book. And I said, oh, you're crazy. I don't have time to write a trade book. I write research papers and textbooks. I said, well, we could write an editorial, Biology of Kindness. And of course, he said, no way. I've written a few books, and I think this is another book. And so talk about the optimist. So then this was November of 2019. He kept at me. And then guess what happened in February of 2020?
I recall.
COVID.
Yeah.
So talk about making, the old lemonade from lemons. I said, okay, you wore me down. My lab is shut down for 2 months, or 3 labs were shut down. If you weren't doing COVID research, I was doing cancer research, they were shut down. So they reopened in June. But at that time, I was home, and the book was originally written in Italian. We, from 2 different continents, sort of figured out what we wanted. He would ask me, what's the good science? Do we have science on optimism? Do we have science on happiness? And we both sort of said, yeah, we have these papers and these papers. And I said, the easiest and most efficient way to write this book is to sort of wrap up my research and sort of translate it into trade language. And then he said, so the word kindness per se is something that I used as a catch-all, right? It's really, there is some study. There are studies on the impact of kindness and health, but not that I'm aware of where they've actually measured telomeres or an objective marker. They're not there yet, because you really need a great instrument to capture the kindness, sort of the way there are standardized instruments to capture optimism, right? There are, yes. So in that way, we came up with the values. Forgiveness is something that he's really interested in because he works with prisoners, and he sort of it's not religion, but I say it's the way he administers forgiveness to the prisoners. So that was very important to him. And so I told him that there are not my own research, but as you know in the book, I reference a lot of other people's research as well, because I wanted to be as comprehensive. This was not a book about Immaculata De Vivo, so to speak, but I wanted it to be a book that encompassed a lot of other research because it makes it that much better. And so, yes, so that's how we narrowed down the values based on the level of how much science there was and how much we could contribute. There was enough information that we could actually write something solidly about. And then the strategies just came naturally because, how do you adapt? And so, of course, the pillars, right, of healthy lifestyle, the conventional ones is good nutrition and actually physical activity. But some of the ones that people don't consider, but we know, like music and increasingly nature, right? Again, people are more and more focused on green space and the direct impacts of green space and the indirect impacts of the direct. If you have green space, people are more likely to walk. They're less obese. The indirect impact of green spaces lowers your fight or flight response. And we know that the stress pathway results in inflammatory markers and oxidative stress that impacts, telomere attrition. So it's all pretty much related.
funny to hear an accomplished scientist refer to herself as a Darwin fangirl, and to consider that it might be more accurate to describe survival of the fittest as survival of the most adaptable. It was also interesting to learn that as a longtime meditator who experienced firsthand the benefits of this practice, Immaculata jumped at the opportunity to study the potential biological proofs to back this up. And many times on this podcast, we've talked about silver linings from tough experiences. In Immaculata's case, the COVID-19 pandemic closed her lab, but she and her co-author used this opportunity to collaborate across 2 different continents to quickly write their terrific book. And in thinking about the benefits of today's technologies, it's helpful to realize that this sort of collaboration, thousands of miles apart, would have been far more difficult just a generation or 2 before our own. Getting back to my blue sky conversation with Immaculata De Vivo, we'll next talk a little more about nature. And I start with mentioning a book called The Last Child in the Woods that was written by a man named Richard Love, whose name I frequently have trouble remembering for some reason. From there, we'll dive into music, and next, drum roll here, optimism. There's a great book written many years ago you may have read, and I can't remember the author's name, but it was called, I think, The Last Child in the Woods. And this guy coined the phrase nature deficit disorder.
Oh, I love that.
This was like pre-social media, but he was worried about kids in front of probably at the time it was probably TV and video games, and they're not getting outside enough. And he was a psychologist, I want to say, and he had a lot of data on that for kids. And nature deficit disorder just stuck in my head. It was at a time, too, when Ritalin was being probably overprescribed. You just thought, you know what, a lot of these kids need to do is go run around with no shoes on. that was part of his thing. And then music struck me, too, because that's one I haven't seen on lists as much. And, I've heard there are several things that separate humans from other species, but music is most definitely one, it seems. And what music can do to you when you're experiencing it, and it takes you to a different place. And can you talk a little about music, and then we're going to do a deep dive on optimism?
Of course. So music, it came naturally because, and I said it in the book, I have really good neighbors that are not only scientists but are musicians. And so, I mean, you have to. The greatest joy is if you can incorporate your hobby into your work, because then it's. Yeah, like I have this much enthusiasm. It's because I do it. This is like, this just gives me so much joy, this kind of work. It gets me out of bed. So music. So a colleague, my friend, and, our Sunday supper night conversation, so to speak, he studies he's a neurologist. He studies the impact of music on the brain, and how we would say that when you suffer a stroke, he would say how people couldn't talk, but they could sing. I got really interested. And as part of my curiosity, whenever I get like a dog on a bone, I get stuck on something, I had to do a deep dive. And so whenever we would meet up again, I say, "Oh, Gottfried, I read this and I read that." And he said, "Oh yeah, they're depending on," and he also plays the organ. He says, depending on if it's Mozart or Beethoven, it has different impacts on blood pressure. And I included all those papers, as you know, in the book. And we know it can lower stress. And with respect to telomeres and attrition and buffering, if it can lower stress and inflammation, it slows down the rate of attrition. Okay. But also to know that it lowers blood pressure and heart rate. Again, that's a direct impact on your fight or flight, because when you are in fight or flight, your heart rate goes up, your blood pressure goes up, so if you can sort of dial that back, you'll get the other effect. So we know that music therapy is often used for stroke patients, as I said, and for CVD. We know it lowers pain, and we know it affects neuroplasticity.
Okay, optimism.
Optimism.
One of the things I appreciated, I get asked all the time, how do you define optimism? And you can find a million of them. You all had a very straightforward one that I really like because it did 2 things. So I'll read what I took out of the book. Optimism is a psychological attribute characterized by the expectation that tomorrow will be better than today. And you also said that optimistic people are often convinced they can control the outcome of certain situations. That second part, I always try to emphasize, because sometimes people push back on optimists and optimism. Well, that's naive. That's pie in the sky. You just think you're going to sit around and things are going to get better. It's like, no. You're going to make it better. You have the ability to make it better. So I really appreciated that. And then you get into the science, and I say to people, optimism in some ways, it's almost a selfish position to take because it's really good for you. So live longer, you avoid getting overwhelmed. These probably all feed into each other. Can you talk about the benefits of optimism to your health?
So I was brought into the optimism world by my neighbor and colleague, Laura Kubansky. She's a professor at Harvard, and she was part of the Optimism Center, or the Center for Happiness at Harvard.
Yes.
And again, it was a grant to study optimism and the impacts on health. And we need a geneticist here because it seems that there's a small, tiny genetic component. And so maybe we should bring in Immaculata and see what we can do. Maybe she will suggest maybe we should study telomeres and et cetera, et cetera. So I actually have to say, I'm an avid reader, and going to some of the meetings that are not in my field is like reading a book. So when I go to these meetings, I don't say much at the beginning, and I literally just absorb it. And I listening to the world of positive psychology and Martin Selig. And yes, this idea that, and the swimmers experiment, by far, come on, Bill,
that's in my notes. Okay,
we'll go
into pause here.
Let's pause.
Yeah, we'll keep going. I've got the swimmers down. We're going to talk about the swimmers.
Brilliant experiment. Okay.
Yeah.
When people ask me about optimism in a talk, that's my go-to.
Yes.
Okay. So optimism. So the way I understood it, and I did the deep dive, and I'm listening to these experts, and it's basically, you could be an optimist and be unhappy at the same time.
Yes.
Optimism is not about being happy. Optimism is a worldview. Today is not a good day, but tomorrow has to be better. And I did a little research on the blue sky, and because sorry, I'm a scientist, so I have to go in prepared. And yes, you guys subscribe to that because
absolutely.
Behind the clouds, there is a blue sky. It will happen. And so I got really taken in with this because I am this. I'm not Pollyanna. As I said, scientists are just natural optimists because your experiments. And when I was a postdoc at Stanford, oh my goodness, these cloning projects, they never worked. And I would say to my colleague, my benchmates, because you're a postdoc, you don't have colleagues, you have benchmates. I would say, okay, when do the stars align? When do the planets align? Because and I'm like, okay, tomorrow we start from scratch. I'm going to go over everything, and eventually things work out. So this idea that it's not, stubborn, not giving up, that's not what it is. It's you know that there are ways in which you can change something to make the outcome better.
Immaculata is fortunate to have scientist neighbors who are also musicians. And it's interesting to learn more about and consider the positive effects of music on the human species. And as we transition to optimism, I was glad to hear Immaculata say very directly that optimism is not about being happy all the time. I know I'm not. It's more of a worldview that tomorrow will be better and that we as individuals have a role to play in making it so. And again, she mentioned scientists having to be optimists. We'll next talk some more about that. I think another thing about scientists, one of the threads I've seen as I've interviewed people with these optimistic frameworks is this voracious appetite to learn more. There's always something more to learn. And in science too, I had Steven Pinker on, and he said, one of the reasons open discourse is important is because if you're honest with yourself as a scientist, you know that most of the things you think are true today, or many of them at least, are not. They're going to be disproved in the future. The things everyone believed, like we talked about telomeres, no one even knew they existed, let alone the role they played. There's always more to learn. And I think that's true for everybody if we're honest with ourselves and not get stuck in our ways and keep reading and keep learning. Is that a fair way to describe it?
You have to keep an open mind and be curious. And I like to say this, and I'll explain what I mean by this. One of the worst things you could do as a scientist is fall in love with your hypothesis. Doesn't mean you don't have a hypothesis.
Right.
It means that you have to evaluate all the data, not just the data that supports or doesn't. So you have to, of course, this is the greatest thing about learning. The more you learn, the more you need to continue to learn. It's an addiction. It's an outright
one. A good one.
Oh, again, a good one. Yes, I agree with that. It's this having an open mind, and I agree with Steve Pinker in that regard. Yes.
You also did a nice job, again, because I agree with it. You're talking about, because I get asked this a lot too. Are you born an optimist or do you learn to be an optimist? And like so many things, it's something in between probably. And I think you said probably 20% of people are born with a more positive, optimistic disposition. But everyone can try to change this and improve on this. And can you describe how someone might go about and say, oh, I'm sorry, I'm just a born pessimist?
Yeah, that's, anybody can say that about anything almost, right? Sort of like, that's the number that's in the literature. I don't know. And like anything, again, like you said, this genetic, to give an example of, so telomere length is partly genetic and partly environmental, the length. And that's, again, makes it really amenable to study to a person like me that wants to understand the impact of your genetics as well as your environment. Because you can see within 10 years and less, the impact of on your DNA from an environmental exposure. So telomeres what was in dispute was how much of it is genetic, how much of it is not. And so the numbers were outrageous, anywhere from like 30 to 90. So to give you an example, now people are settling more around 60, seems to be very consistent. So I say that because of that 20%, that 25% with optimism. I'm only, the number that we used in the book was one that had a reference, right? Because you just don't want to, So but yes, but even if it is 20%, let's go with that. It's tiny. That gives you 80% of ways in which you can better that. And personally speaking, physical activity, personally speaking, being outside in nature, and some of the options that, or the ways in which true optimist practitioners or people who, psychiatrists, psychologists, social scientists who use optimism, who help people become more optimistic, journaling, volunteering. What I learned was that if acts that take a lot of the focus off of you can also be very helpful. So I volunteer at a food pantry. The book was easy for me to write in a way because I wasn't writing about stuff that I had no clue. It was and people, oh my God, Immaculata, you wrote that book in like 2 months. It was my papers plus my own. It wasn't anything I had to borrow. And there was conviction. There was strong, I'm a product of a lot of what I write.
Yes.
It works.
Yeah, it absolutely works.
It works.
And one of your five values is gratitude. And sometimes combining journalism with the gratitude journal. Or I interviewed Richie Davidson from the University of Wisconsin, who I just love. And he talked about the simple act when he's working with people to try to change their outlook. The simple act of he said, pick one meal a day, call it dinner, do this for a week, look at your plate, look at everything on your plate, and be grateful. Think about the farmer who grew the peas, the person who loaded the peas on the truck, the person who drove the truck to the grocery store, the person at the grocery store who did the checkout, all the things, then people who contributed to this meal in front of you. Take 5 minutes. He said, you do that 1 meal a day for a week, I guarantee you'll feel better.
And actually, during this optimism group, when I would come home, I would try to, because I want to learn too. I'm a scientist.
Yeah,
I want
sure.
to learn.
Right.
I may be optimistic, but I could learn some of these techniques and share it with other people. And so I came home once and I said to my daughter, I said, I learned something today, that before you go to bed, if you can talk about 3 things that you were grateful for today, it makes a difference. And she said, well, I don't know. So many things happened today. I go, 3 simple things.
Simple.
Well, she said, very simple things. I got to play with blah, blah, blah. Simple. I went to swim practice and then we did that for a while. And it was good for the 2 of us to partake in that.
When I mentioned to Immaculata that an orientation towards constantly learning can feed optimism, she added the simple recommendation that we keep an open mind. As society seems to push us into taking a stand on each and every issue, and at a time when a legitimate changing of one's mind can be labeled as flip-flopping or being wishy-washy, it can be hard to keep an open mind, and as Immaculata says, not fall in love with our hypothesis. And I really appreciated Immaculata's suggestion that, and I quote, acts that take the focus off yourself are helpful. I'll give a hearty amen to that. Now, back to our final segment, and at long last, the aforementioned swimmer experiment. Let's talk about Martin Seligman and the swimmer experiment. So Martin Seligman wrote on this subject, and he was one of the first people, I think, or most well-known for measuring. There are ways you can measure optimism. But this swimmer example, again, it was in my notes. You brought it up earlier. Can you explain to us what this experiment was and what the conclusions were?
And I will be very brief. Essentially, there were 2 groups of swimmers. Okay, it's like, 2 people walk into there are 2 groups of swimmers. And so the experiment was, what if they're in a competition, and what if we tell them their times are off just a little bit? You see, how will they react?
And they're worse. Their times are worse than they.
That's right. I'm sorry. They're worse. Right. Yeah. Just a tiny bit worse.
Yeah.
Such that they would believe it. Not, you can't say they were like huge amounts of time off, right? That they would be worse. And then have them get back in the water and see if they can improve their time. So what happened was, so that they swam their race. And of course they gave them the worst time, tiny. And then they said, okay, get back in and let's see what happens. And so some of the swimmers, given the same bad news, actually did better on their time, whereas some, though, actually did worse. So the bad news somehow hit them hard, right? Like, I can't improve on this. I'm speaking for the swimmers. I don't know, but that's what the results show. Whereas the other person, like, I can do better than this. I'm motivated by the bad news, right? And whereas the other, they sort of like were held back by the bad news. They didn't think they could get better.
Exactly.
It's just classic.
Yeah. And I think those swimmers were separately screened for optimism and pessimism. And it was
That's correct.
And it lined right up. So the optimist said, shoot, that's off my time, but I've trained, I know I can do better next time. I can impact the outcome next time. Versus the pessimists are like, oh man, I'm losing it. And they get in the pool and they go through the motions and they do even worse.
And it's sort of like, these people, like, oh, everything happens to me. It's all bad. It's, and you just, when I hear people do that, I have sort of like, I just want to hug them and say, no, it's really, you can really try,
Right.
You can really try. And I'm a runner. So I happen to, personal best is what you go for, right? Some days you have it, some days you don't.
Exactly.
But it's okay.
But you get back the next day.
Exactly.
It's going to be better. Seligman did the similar things with, in his quiz, I think, or the test to gauge your own optimism. It's things like, you do poorly on a test. Optimists will say, well, shoot, that was yeah, there's something about the way that was worded. That's why I didn't get it. Or, I can study a little bit harder next time versus the pessimist like, I'm stupid. I'm no good at finance, or I'm no good at math. I'm no good at science. And it's again, because that's the other thing. Optimists don't say bad things aren't going to happen. They acknowledge they absolutely will. Full stop. That's life. It's always been hard. Bad things are going to happen. It's all about how you take it in and then how you respond. So the swimmers, you get a bad time. It's, I stink. I'm no good at swimming. This training's not paying off. And they get even worse. Versus the optimist who says, okay, I can do better. I probably didn't do the flip turns right or whatever, right?
Right. It's not about being happy. Two things can be true. You can be an optimist and be unhappy. It's a worldview that things will get better. And actually, I'm known for that. When I do these science programming at the Harvard Radcliffe Institute, I always say, guys, we're doing a program on climate change. I really want everyone to leave the auditorium hopeful. Can I please close it in a hopeful way? And I often do that because I often do the closing on these science symposiums that we run. And I have like a top 10, like, what did we learn today?
Yeah.
And we learned this and that. But we also learned that we are making improvements in how people can do little things every day. Little things every day add up to big things over time, and I think that's really the definition of what, and if you're an optimist, you're likely to eat better. You're likely to say, I want to take care of my body better. I'll go for a walk, or I'll go for a bike ride, or, I need to get out of my head. I'm going to go sign up and do some volunteering. I might go buy groceries for a neighbor. And sometimes when I do these interviews that they say, is there a misconception about being kind? I go, that it requires an enormous amount of effort and work. You just ask someone if they're having a good day. You call your credit card company even after you've been on hold for, let's be optimistic, 15 minutes.
Yeah, right.
And then you say, but how are you doing? And they're always stunned when I say that. They're like, I'm okay, Yep. So it doesn't require a lot of effort. It really doesn't. And I want to be sensitive to, sometimes I say these things and they said, well, you can't assume because life hasn't been kind to everyone. I get it. I completely get it. And that's why I think just extending a little bit of kindness, I call it baseline humanity, really, to your fellow person is the least we can do.
Well, Immaculata De Vivo, I can't think of a better way to wrap up this fantastic conversation. I really appreciate you taking the time to be with me, and I really recommend the Biology of Kindness to everyone out there. If I can understand it, you can understand it. It's very accessible, very uplifting and interesting. Thank you for all you do. I really appreciate it.
I know this is a podcast, but I'm blushing. Thank you very much. Thank you so much, Bill. And you are so genteel and really kind. I really appreciate the time you took to talk with me.
Thank you.
Be well.
Take care. Martin Seligman's swimmer experiment has really stayed with me. In this study, the disappointingly slow swim time can be seen as a proxy for life's inevitable setbacks. The response, either swimming the next time more quickly or more slowly, is a reflection not so much of the athlete's training or technique, but rather their mindset. Optimistic swimmers improved their times while the pessimist's second attempts were slower than their first. Pretty amazing stuff. And I think that Immaculata sets a great goal for herself when she gives speeches or conducts workshops. She says she sets out to have her audience and colleagues leave the auditorium hopeful. That's really the way I hope you end these podcasts. More hopeful than when you started, and with an understanding that despite humanity's many challenges, we are indeed making progress. Now, I hope you enjoyed this blue sky conversation with Immaculata De Vivo. Before you go, please consider leaving us a rating or review. Subscribe to this podcast and check out the Optimism Institute on social media. My special thanks, as always, go to the team at Sound On Studios for their incredible help with editing and mixing this and all of our Blue Sky episodes. You can learn more about their work at soundonstudios.com. And all graphic design and cover art for Blue Sky and the Optimism Institute are provided by Crush Graphics. That's Crush with a K, if you'd like to check out more of their fantastic work online. Until next time, I'm the founder of the Optimism Institute and the genteel host of Blue Sky, couldn't let that one go, Bill Burke, and I thank you for listening.